Thank you very much. I always find those introductions slightly awkward and uncomfortable, so anyway, there we go. I should say that, in fact, it was meant to be two clients and someone from a research company today. I'm actually standing in for a guy called Dan Burdett, who's our global brand director on Snickers, who was supposed to be here, but I think is in Chicago at the moment, the last minute. So I'm standing in for Dan, who's been a great partner with us on this business from the outset. For me, this is a great opportunity. This is a campaign that I have been involved with since the beginning. The campaign actually debuted in the Super Bowl in January 2010, so it's 5 years old now. But I was doing a little bit of prep over the weekend. I have actually prepared for this. I was doing a little bit of prep over the weekend. And it occurred to me, I sort of thought, I've been working on this longer. I'm certain that I was working on this campaign before my son was born. He's 6.5. So I went back and looked at sort of some of the data and some of the things. And I've actually been working on the campaign for 7 years. So it actually took us 2 years to kind of give birth to this thing, if you will. And I think that's sort of my first point, which is that multi-market campaigns are really hard work. Carlos talked about the fact that there are only 12 papers and it's worth a shot, it's a good punt. Yeah, that's true, but I sort of think part of the reason there are only 12 is it's really, really hard work. The truth is getting to any IPA effectiveness winning paper, so creating a brilliant, effective campaign for a single market is really tough. When you start to do it for multi-markets, you're adding in more markets, more cultures, more stakeholders, more clients, more agencies, just more of everything, which makes it a lot more difficult. So the first thing I would say is that developing successful multi-market campaigns, particularly ones that are built to last, takes patience, perseverance, clarity, and I'll come on to that, and probably, if I'm honest, a little bit of luck. And I think the first challenge that you need to confront, I think, is that the business, and this is going to sound really patently obvious, but you'd be surprised. The business has to buy into the need and the benefit for a global campaign. And I think the key thing is, both globally and locally, the global brand director will always think that this is an inspired idea. But I think in any organization, unless it's unbelievably centralized, and there are very few that really fit the bill, the local marketeers, the local GMs, the regional presidents, they have a fair bit of influence. And so I think one of the key things is you need to get the whole business to buy into the case for why you want to make these kinds of campaigns and what you think the benefits are. And it's not just as simple as we think we can save money. So historically, Mars has been an incredibly decentralized organization, and it's been one of the keys to the success of the business over the last sort of 80 years. But by 2009, we sort of had a sense that that freedom, at least on Snickers, wasn't particularly working. Growth had slowed pretty dramatically. So from 07 to 09, we lagged the growth of brands like Kit Kat, Oreos, and actually one of our own M&Ms. So we were actually in danger, if we didn't pick up the growth rate, of falling behind and no longer being the world's biggest chocolate bar brand, which in the grand scheme of things doesn't really matter, but to a client is deeply important. And I certainly didn't want to be the guy who saw us slip to number 2. And the other thing is, when we sat down and looked at our communications, what we realized it was incredibly disparate. We had, the way we described it was a brand that was global rather than a global brand. And yes, the nameplate, the packaging was the same pretty much everywhere, but we really weren't communicating and showing up like a global brand. So in that spirit, which many have squandered over the years of don't let a good crisis go to waste, we went to the business and said, look, growth is slowing, has slowed. The communication is all over the shop. Now is the time. And we sat down, but I think critically we sat down with the global team, and we sat down with the local marketeers from the top 10 markets, which almost always will get you about 80% of your volume, and said, look, guys, we think there's an opportunity here to really unlock growth and better creative consistency and quality and impact if we work together to get to a global campaign. So I think that's sort of one of the key things, is really ensure the business is bought into it. The first step for us then was to sort of focus on our ambition and objectives. And again, I think this was really critically important to both our impact and effectiveness across markets. And what we did was we went back and looked at how our best Snickers work had worked over the years and focused on how we thought this campaign could work. Now, Mars have done a lot of work with Byron Sharp and the folks at Ehrenberg Bass, so they've completely bought into the notion that penetration is the thing that, particularly in FMCG, is going to give you your biggest business uplift. So we very quickly zeroed down on the notion that, right, penetration is what we want this campaign to drive across different markets. And that obviously has some impact on some of the choices that you make from a creative development point of view. But the other thing that we did was we went back and looked at the periods when the business had been at its most successful. When were we at our sort of When was the business really flying? We looked across markets. And this, again, may sound patently obvious, but what we found was the points when the brand had been at its most famous, in some cases infamous, but the points when we had sort of achieved maximum fame were also the points when we achieved maximum penetration and maximum share. So that gave us a clear steer that really what we wanted this campaign to do was to drive fame. So we set that as our comms objective. And this kind of meant that the advertising then, because we wanted penetration and we wanted fame, meant the campaign had to appeal to a really broad audience. Now, you can look, I'm the first to admit, you can look at that model and say, it's really a fairly simplistic model. We want a universal story, flexible creative idea, bit of local fame that will increase penetration and drive. It's a pretty simplistic model, I'm the first to admit that. But what it is very clear, very easily understood to local marketeers. And it does actually, if you sit down and think about it, and I'll sort of talk about it a little bit, it does force choices in the kinds of strategies you're going to pursue and the kind of work that you're going to develop and the kind of sort of creative platform that you're going to develop. And I think that's sort of the key thing, is to get to that kind of model and to get buy-in again to the model. So having had that, we then went on the hunt for a global insight, because by and large, not impossible to create a successful multi-market campaign without one, but by and large, they're most successful when you have a global insight. And specifically what we were looking for was an insight into our sort of bullseye creative target audience. Something that would be sort of, but something that would have resonance and could allow us to talk to lots of different people. And again, we went back and sort of looked at the history of the brand. And it's actually an American brand originally, so it's actually, I would say, we've always been a dude's brand, is what my American and indeed Canadian colleagues would say. I mean, we've always been a blokey brand. And if you look at the history of the brand, again, when we've been most successful, when we've been at our best, we've been talking about sports and girls and banter and guys hanging out and extreme sports and all those sort of things that 16 to 18 to 20-year-old dudes do. And one of the things I would say is, don't be afraid if you've got a brand that has a long and storied history to go back and look at where it's been at its best. Because there were probably some fairly smart people who preceded you. And yes, the media environment in which they were operating may have been very different. The business environment in which they were operating may have been very different. But they probably at some point latched onto something sensible if you've got an 80 or 90-year-old brand that's been around and is still successful. So don't be afraid to go back and look at where have you been successful and what can you take forward when as you sort of go on to it. So that led us to our sort of universal insight, which is there's an unwritten universal code of behavior that guys live by in order to maintain their position in their pack of mates. Or sort of put in simple terms, male packs have an unwritten code. And God help you if you transgress that code. Now, I talked about the need for a universal insight with broad appeal. And one of the issues we wrestle with is people, well, yeah, that's an insight, but it's an insight that's relevant to 16 to 18-year-old guys, or 18 to 20-year-old guys. But I would argue, and the argument that we made to the business was, that's true, but if you've ever been a 16 or 18-year-old guy, or you've ever been the mother, girlfriend, or sister of a 16 or 18-year-old guy, you understand that insight. You kind of get what that means. You know what it's like to be a teenage boy, to live in that world. It's what film franchises like The Hangover, 40-Year-Old Virgin, American Pie, they were all built on that insight. It is a universal insight that has broad appeal that everybody can understand. And the trick then becomes creatively, how do you express it in such a way that it has broad appeal? So with that sort of insight in mind, the next thing we were really focused on was finding a consistent and clear role for the brand. Most advertising we know fails because it's not well branded. We were absolutely not going to let that happen with Snickers. So one of the things we looked for was what's a really clear role given the insight that we have. Now the reality is it's a very simple product. It is, amazingly, it is largely unchanged since its invention in the 1930s. One of my favorite clients used to say, look, we just lucked out. We have the killer app. We created it in 1933, and there it is. And it's literally, it's a big bar filled with peanuts, caramel, and nougat covered in milk chocolate. It's very, very tasty, very, very satisfying, very, very filling. And we've always, back through history, positioned it as it's either for hunger or energy, and frankly, they're two sides of the same coin. If you're hungry, you lack energy. If you need energy, you might be hungry. So it's about hunger and energy. So the question we asked ourselves was, well, given that we have this insight about guys in the pack, what would hunger and lack of energy, what impact might that possibly have, and how can we sort of leverage the product into that? Which gets us to that. You're not you when you're hungry, which is the creative idea that has now been running around the world for 5 years. How many of you have seen at least one of the You're Not You When You're Hungry ads or are familiar with it? Excellent, because I'm not going to show any work. And the longhand version of that is when you're hungry, you're off your game. Snickers is the bar of substance that sorts you out. Now, following the model that we created, what we did, we gave people a clear insight, a story, and a flexible creative platform, and then we turned them loose to create local fame. So all of the all of the TV ideas initially have a celebrity who is sort of playing the traits of someone who's off their game. They eat a Snickers bar, they return to being just a regular average bloke. I won't pretend to be able to tell you who all of these celebrities are in places like India and Turkey. I at some point knew them, I can't think of their names now. But a couple of things. So they used local celebrities who were resonant, though obviously some of these celebrities, Joe Pesci has global appeal and lots of these ads have run in different markets around the world. But we gave them flexibility to use local talent, local celebrity, but also to leverage the insights about hunger that they thought might be most relevant. So in some would be sort of, as you'll see, someone becomes irritable or is a bit of a diva. That's one that tends to play pretty well around the world. Weak and pathetic, it's interesting, you get different. So weak and pathetic. So the original ad, Betty White, you're playing like a little old lady. That insight plays very badly in Asia because it seemed to be very disrespectful to the elderly, and that's very wrong. So again, the idea is still sound, but the way that you bring it to life, the way that you express it, has different impacts. So as I say, the ambition was to get it to run and sort of give people the opportunity to create local fame. In year one, we had 4 markets that got on board. It didn't all happen overnight. It's not the kind of business where you just say to 100 markets, right, go. Sort of had to sell it in slowly, but success tends to sort of create drag. And it's now running in 92 markets around the world. So from 4 markets 5 years ago to 92 markets, I think is reasonably good. And as I said, true to the model, one of the things we tried to do was create this idea, this platform that would allow local markets to innovate, to be timely, to be local, to exploit opportunities as they came up, because we really wanted the local marketeers to feel invested in this. So this is a tweet, I'm sure you can all figure out when it ran. It's from the US team that ran during the World Cup last year when Suarez bit Cellini. The world and their wife jumped on this. We were the first brand to jump on it. When Mr. Clarkson had his little meltdown here in the UK, this was the Twitter response here in the UK. He was very gracious about it, by the way, which is apparently atypical for him. And then this is just a sample of, we've got this thing running around the world called You're Not YouTube, where we've worked with YouTube content creators around the world who have big followings, and we've asked them to film a segment where they're off their game. They then eat a Snickers and return to being themselves. And again, you can see it's run in lots of different markets around the world. Now, I've got about 2 minutes left, and I'm meant to be talking to you about effectiveness and multi-market effectiveness and measurement. And why am I showing you all this creative work? I think part of it is that I really fundamentally believe that the platform and the local engagement that it allowed us to drive was critical to the impact and effectiveness that we had in market. I was joking with Emily earlier that I'm possibly the only global planner in the world who really doesn't fundamentally believe in big global ads. Yes, they can be made to work. It does happen. But I think what happens quite often when you do that is you forget about the engagement of local markets. And at the end of the day, sales happen in local markets. And so keeping them engaged, keeping them sort of active is really, really important. And I think without the local fame, we would not have achieved the global fame, sort of global success that we have. And given that ambition, this to me, that sort of global and local fame, this to me is exactly the kind of thing you want to see. When you see this, you think, yes, we're onto something. When I've got people in local markets taking amazing pop culture icons like Kim Jong-un and Psy and turning them into content that's branded, by the way, right? Eat a Snickers. That's Snickers branded content. You're onto a winner. You've got a campaign that is probably certainly driving fame and probably driving effectiveness. And I think the reason I sort of finish with this from a content point of view is I think one of the things when you look at multi-market effectiveness, you need to be really open to both hard measures and soft measures. Now, Mars is a big multinational company. We do lots of pre-testing. We have single source advertising tracking in 10 key markets around the world. We take the big, serious, grown-up metrics very seriously. This campaign drove, I'll get my numbers right, 15.9% global growth in its first year, which for an 80-year-old brand that had pretty much universal distribution at that point is pretty good, and has added more than $400 million in incremental sales in its period. So it's been incredibly successful from a business building point of view. But I think you need to also be open to looking at the social media metrics, the fame metrics, is it generating PR? Are people talking about it online? Particularly if those softer metrics are in line with the way you think the campaign is going to work and what you're trying to achieve with that campaign. As Carlos kindly said, I've won. He'll kill me for saying this, but so I've had the pleasure to win sort of 4 IPA effectiveness awards. When I go back and revisit them, they're really good stories, with solid to okay data. I've never, people have won them for absolutely killer data, but not a brilliantly written story. I've never done it that way. So I think, be open to different ways of looking at data that will help you understand, how your campaign is working and how it sort of might work best. And I'm going to finish with this. So Carlos, it'd be good to have sort of three top tips to take away. So for me, it's very simple. It's invest the time and energy in getting the business to buy into the ambition and the model and the way that this communication is going to work. Because if you can't bring the business along with you, you'll get a campaign that might last for 6, 12 months, and then somebody else will come in and the business will sort of change and stuff will happen and you'll lose it. The second one is, it's very popular nowadays to say it's all about the execution. Ideas don't matter. You need a platform. You need a big idea that your local marketers can understand and embrace and run with and really sort of do something with. And the third one is, as I say, be open to hard and soft metrics. Absolutely, at the end of the day, if it's not building the business, you'll know about it and it will go pear-shaped. But be open to looking for some of those soft metrics that might act as leading indicators. Thank you very much.